Okay, good morning from my home in Canada. My name's Joanna. I'll be guiding you for the next 30 minutes for the student development session. And today we're looking at effective and simple modifications and variations for very commonly used asana in our practices. So you'll see that I have some props. So there's two blocks, a bolster and a blanket. Those will be the main props that we use today. So if you have those to hand, bring them to your mat. If you don't, you can always use books, cushions, pillows, or pieces of clothing. To be alternative options. So we only have a very short session, so I want to get through as many asanas as we can. So we're going to just dive straight on in, and if you want to join in, feel free. It can be a really great way to integrate the learning into your body, especially if you are a visual or kinesthetic learner. This might be a great way for you to really understand what these modifications and variations can look like and feel like in the body. Or if you prefer to simply sit and watch and observe and maybe take notes that way, then feel free. A lot of the things I'll be addressing today you might already know, or for some of you it might be completely new. Whatever the case, I invite you to be open and take from this session today what you need. Okay, so I'm going to start us off in standing forward fold, so Uttanasana. So we're going to come to the front edge of the mat and we're going to grab our two blocks. So I'm going to take the two blocks as an assist for the hands. A lot of students are not able to touch their fingertips to the floor. And that's completely normal because many of us are very tight in the hamstrings. But it's not often that a teacher will offer the blocks as an option for the hands. So always remember that the blocks are really great space fillers. So offer the blocks underneath the hands. They can be at any height depending on what the student needs. So high, middle, or low. And if you just tell your students to have those blocks at the front edge of their mat before practice begins, then they are there. They're ready to go when you come into a standing forward fold, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of standing forward folds in your class. It might be good to set up those blocks first. So here we are, we're standing with our feet in parallel hip distance apart, and we're just rooting down through all corners of the feet, spreading the toes, softening through the knees. So with the knees a little bit soft, I'm just hinging forwards at the hips, folding the chest over the thighs, and then resting those hands to your lovely blocks. Make sure the blocks are your shoulder distance apart and in front of your mat. So here is one option. You'll see as well that the knees are very soft here in the forward fold, so that students can encourage belly and chest over their thighs. And then from there, as the student gets used to being in the fold, they can play with leaning a bit more weight into the 10 toes and a little less weight into the heels, and maybe play with lengthening the backs of their legs a bit more. You might also find that you have students in your practice that have dizziness or nausea or vertigo, and lowering the head below the heart is not a great idea for those students. So again, having the blocks there is a really great way for students to keep their chest a little more elevated and their head a little higher. So you can invite the students to look down at the floor instead of looking towards their shins, and that will keep their head a little higher than their heart. Or you can bring your students' forearms to thighs, lengthening through the spine, shoulders relaxed, and again, head is higher than heart. If you find that students in your class are looking for a little more challenge, or you want to dive into some variations of a forward fold, especially if you're doing multiple forward folds in your practice, you might encourage your students to play with fingertips to the earth or peace fingers around the big toes, elbows wide, and then hugging the chest towards the thighs, or hands underneath the fronts of the feet. So palms face up, pressing the toes into the wrist creases, lengthening the arms, and again, leaning the weight into the 10 toes gives a great hamstring stretch, but it also can give a really nice release to the wrists if you've been doing a lot of work on the hands in class. You can also encourage the students to bend their elbows towards their shins to increase that wrist stretch. And then finally, you have options with the hands. So hands can go around opposite elbows, head heavy between the arms, creates a little more extra weight to the upper body over the lower body. Or if you're wanting to get into the shoulders and chest, maybe interlace hands on the lower back and extend your long arms towards the sky, head heavy. Or a favorite I'm working with at the moment is hands resting on the back of the head and just actively pulling down with the head and the hands. So you feel a little decompression between your head, neck, and shoulders. Just go gently with that one. Okay, so that is a few options for a standing forward fold. Further to this, let's step back with the left foot and come into a lunge. So here again, you've got the option of those lovely blocks. A lot of students are not going to bring their hands to the earth. It's not comfortable, it creates too much compression. So hands on blocks. Hands can be on blocks at any height, depending on what feels good for your student. So they can come up a little higher, lifting the chest, or they can be a little lower, or they could have the blocks at their lowest point. Maybe that's the right fit for your students. This also gives a little bit of a bigger, secure base. Also in your lunge option, you have the you have the option to lower that back knee onto something cushioned, something padded. Really good for knee sensitivity. So please offer that. And then from here, you might be inviting your students to release hands from the floor. So think about that inner leg engagement, so that scissoring of the front hip back and the back hip forwards. Maybe hands come onto the front thigh, testing balance. Maybe hands on hips, or maybe arms overhead. If students are near a wall, they can also use the wall as a support for balance. This goes for a low lunge or for a high lunge. And then a couple extra variations from here. You can work into the movement of the spine. So from a upright position with the arms overhead, you might invite in a twist. So you can turn the chest, with this side we're turning the chest to the right, towards the right leg, opening up the arms in a wide T. Or with arms overhead, you could bring your hands into prayer and then turn the chest to the right and play with hooking your left elbow over your right thigh and turning your chest more to the right. We could get into a side stretch, so right hand on the right hip, left arm up and overhead. Or we could get into a gentle back bend, so again, interlacing hands on the lower back, rolling the shoulders up, back and down, maybe extending the arms behind you and maybe lifting your chin and chest. Or if the arms were overhead, you might interlace the hands overhead and then place the hands behind the head, widen the elbows and lean the head back into the hands. So many options. for your lunge sequence. From here, let's move into plank pose. So for your plank, again, you might have students that wish to have their knees to the earth. So offer a blanket under the knees. And then first options are with your hands under your shoulders. And then tucking your toes and either extending your legs long and straight, hugging those heels towards the back of the room, drawing your tailbone towards your belly button, lifting through your chest, or gently dropping those knees onto the blanket or cushion beneath you, drawing your tailbone towards your belly button and enjoying that core strengthening shape. If students have wrist sensitivity, this might not be a great option for them, being on their flat hands. So a couple of options. Some students like to come up onto their fists, so that might work. Or some students may prefer to be on their forearms. So forearms are as wide as the shoulders. You want to check that your elbows are underneath the shoulders and the hands are flat. And from here, there is lots of core engagement. You can have the knees to the earth here, or you could have your knees lifted. And then a couple of nice variations from your plank pose would be side plank. So you could bring your right hand to the middle of the mat, roll onto the outer edge of that right foot, stack your left foot on top of the right foot, and maybe lift your left arm to the sky. You could always have your left foot in front of the right foot if that feels more stable, or left hand on the earth. Another option is from full plank, coming up into downward facing dog, and then rolling forwards again into your plank pose. It's a great way to build strength. You can also do that from forearms if you have students on their forearms, walking their feet towards their elbows, lifting the back of the pelvis to the sky, and then walking those feet back, creating that long plank line once again. Whew, that one got me warm. Okay, so we've done standing forward fold, we've done lunges, we've done planks. So now let's move into child's pose, a very commonly used asana in our practices. So I'm going to keep the blanket underneath the knees for this one. Again, lots of knee sensitivity in students. So give them lots of padding options for knees and ankles. Give your students the option to keep their knees together or to widen the knees and keep the big toes together. Starting to melt the pelvis back to the heels. Now, as students come into this shape, you're going to see if they need extra support pretty quickly. If there's a big gap between a student's pelvis and heels, grab that rolled up blanket or bolster and place it into the space between hips and heels. That's going to offer really nice support for those students, giving the pelvis something to rest against. If students are drawing their forehead towards the floor, great. Again, if students have any dizziness or nausea, vertigo, or it's just not comfortable to lower the head towards the floor, offer your students a block for under their forehead. They can have the block at any height, so high, medium, or low, and they can place their forehead to that block. Not only does this keep their head a little higher than their heart, but it also gives the neck a rest from holding the head up. And then options for the arms, depending on shoulder mobility or shoulder sensitivity. Some students will enjoy extending the arms long and straight and forwards towards the front of the mat. Some students will need to bend the elbows more, so make sure that you offer that. And then some variations in this shape. You might come into a tricep stretch, so bringing the hands together, elbows on the floor, and then bringing the thumbs towards the back of the head, neck, or shoulders, offering a lovely tricep stretch. You might encourage your students to walk their elbows a little further forwards and then sink their chest a little further towards the mat. Hands can always rest on the back of the head, neck, or shoulders if that feels more comfortable. Or another option is to wrap the arms around the outsides of the legs and place one ear to the floor. This is a really nice option if you've been doing a lot of work in the shoulders and arms in practice. So really letting the arms get nice and heavy. You can spend a few breaths on one side and then you can invite your students to turn their head the other way. And then another variation from here is to come into a side body stretch. So you can be with arms extended forwards and then invite your students to walk their hands over to the right and then bow their head in between their arms, hugging the left hip back and down so they can feel a stretch in the left side of their body, maybe left hand resting on top of the right hand. And you can do the same the other way, moving over on the inhale and then on the exhale, landing, finding the stretch in the right side of the body, maybe right hand on top of left, right hip back on right heel. And then back to center. Taking a full inhale and exhale back in child's pose. Now we'll move into pigeon pose. Pigeon pose is a great hip opener if it feels great in your body. If it doesn't, then you can be left feeling like there's nothing for you to do or there's no options. So whenever you offer pigeon pose, not only offer options in pigeon pose, but offer options for a different shape altogether to accommodate everybody's hips and knees. So I'll show you the options in pigeon pose and then I'll show you the options to offer other students as well. So hands and knees. We'll do the right side. So you're extending your right leg back and then lifting the right heel to the same height as your right hip. We're hugging the right knee into the chest and lowering the right knee behind the right wrist crease. Wiggle your right heel forwards and then start to extend your left leg back behind you, lowering your pelvis towards the floor. Untucking that back foot and then just checking that the top of the foot and the left knee are resting to the floor. So you don't want this left leg turning out. Hips are parallel to the mat. Now, if your right hip is very elevated off the floor, you might bring a block under the right hip so that you have something to sit on. And then from here, you can decide whether that right heel stays close or you wiggle the right heel a little further forwards. Keep flexing that right foot. Keep checking that the hips and chest are facing forwards. Now, maybe your students don't need props under their hips, but maybe your students would enjoy props under the hands. So again, bring those blocks in and use them as support for under the hands, especially if you're spending a bit of time in an upward shape. So stretching the front lines of the torso and into that left hip flexor. Hands on blocks might feel good. Or if you're encouraging your students to fold forwards, maybe they stack some blocks and other props in front of them so that when they lower their forearms and hinge forwards from the hips, they're not going too deep too quickly. They can layer up some props so that they are a little more elevated. And then if you're staying here for time, they might choose to start to remove a prop or two and lower a bit further into the pose. If you have students who are quite open here, then maybe they're just using their forearms on the earth. Maybe a upright block for their forehead might feel nice. Deeper options here are to rest one hand on top of the other, and then the forehead to the hands, melting the chest a little closer to the mat. Or a variation here would be to come into king pigeon, so you could have your students be upright, root down through the right hand and right hip, and then play with extending your left arm back behind you, opening the chest to the left, so you're getting into a twist. And then option to bend that left knee and see if the left hand and the left foot want to meet one another. If that's the case with some of your students, great, they can keep hugging that left heel towards their glute. If that's not for some students, then just let it pass them by, it's no problem. So those are all the options for pigeon, but you might have some students who are not comfortable in this shape. So alternative options for them would be either deer pose, which is still a seated version of the shape, or we can offer them thread the needle on their back. So deer pose would be both legs bent. So you've got your front leg where it was in pigeon pose, but now your back leg is bent. You might want students to put a bit of extra padding under that left knee. And once that left leg is bent, they don't really have to think too much about it. The left foot's relaxed, the left knee is padded if needed, the right leg is still their focus, this right hip. So right heel can be as close or as far from the midline as is comfortable, hips and chest facing forwards. And then all those same options I just offered for pigeon pose. You can either be upright, so hands on the floor, or maybe hands on blocks would feel nice. Or you might start to fold forwards and come onto your forearms. Or you might lower your forehead down onto a block. So those same options apply, but it's a little less pressure perhaps in some students' hips and knees. And then the third option is thread the needle. So this is a really great option for students who have a lot of knee or hip sensitivity. This variation is going to offer less compression on those joints perhaps. So for those students, you would bring them onto the back, and we'll still focus on the right hip, so we're all doing the same side at the same time. So they'd have their knees bent, feet to the floor, and flex the right foot up to the sky. Externally rotate that right leg, so they're turning out the right knee, right toes, right hip, and then crossing the right ankle onto the left thigh. The reason I always offer that cue from this position to ankle over thigh, that rotation is so important because we want the turnout to be in the hip. We don't simply want to turn out from the knee. So here you are, you've got students in this thread the needle position on their backs. For some students, this will be enough. They can have their right hand on their inner right thigh if they wish to press the right knee wider, left hand on the floor. Some students will want a bit more here. So they have the option of placing a block or two underneath the left foot. So they have a little more elevation of the legs, and that might create a deeper stretch in the right hip. Or they have the option to bring both of their legs into the chest and wrap their hands around the back of the left hamstring or around the left shin. And they can continue to widen that right knee by pressing their right forearm into their inner right thigh, flexing the right foot, relaxing the shoulders, and relaxing the tailbone to the floor. Oh my goodness, we're going to get through all of them. Okay, and the last one I'm going to guide you through is recline twist. Many of us finish our practices with some kind of twist before Shavasana because it is a very cooling on the body, it's soothing on the nervous system, it helps us to wind down towards rest. So when we offer reclined twists, no matter what type of twist it is, make sure you are still offering options. So I'm going to guide a 2-knee twist with options. We'll take the twist to the right. So both knees are bent, feet to the floor. We're moving the hips to the left and we're lowering the knees to the right. Now, some students will need a block underneath the knees or hips, and some students will need a block between the inner legs or knees. Really encourage students to use those props because you want the knees and legs to feel heavy and relaxed to this right side. You don't want to feel like you're holding your legs up because then you're clenching and you're not relaxing. So use the support of the props to help fill any gaps between your body and the floor. Some students won't need the props or between their legs. Their knees will naturally rest heavy to that right side. Another option here is hands staying on the body. Hands staying on the body is less twists, not so deep. It can also be very comforting, grounding, and nurturing. So they could have one hand on the legs, one hand on the rib cage perhaps. Or if your students are opening their arms wide, some students might have some shoulder sensitivity and the gap between their shoulder and the floor might need an extra prop. So you could roll up the blanket or place a bolster into that space between the shoulder and the floor. And the arms can be wide or in a cactus shape, whatever feels good. And then the gaze can either be straight up to the sky, or students might turn their head in the opposite direction to their knees, depending on whether that feels good through the spine, through the neck and head. And then if you want to take this a few steps further, a couple of options here for a stretch into the IT band. You could encourage your students to extend their top leg. So on this side, it's the left leg extending over to the right. You're flexing that left foot and you're lowering that left foot towards the floor. Again, if the left leg is kind of hovering, it's not settled, that means you're clenching, you are holding, and we're looking for a stretch here. So we want this left leg to be relaxed. So if the left leg is floating, you might ask students to put blocks under that leg. Otherwise, left foot is resting on the floor. So this can be a lovely stretch into the IT band. Your right hand can be resting on that left leg to hold it in place. Or you can take this a little step further and move it into pulling on a cat's tail. So for that, you would take your left hand to your right foot behind your body. And if the two find one another, great. If they don't worry. If the two find one another, you're hugging your right knee back in line with your right hip. So your right thigh bone is running parallel with the long edge of your mat. And then again, you can look up to the sky or you can turn your head to the left. So this is a deep twist for the back, but this will also create a deep stretch perhaps in your left IT band and your right quadricep muscle and hip flexor. So there you have it. There is just a handful of shapes and a handful of variations and modifications. I know it is endless what we can offer to our students and creative ways we can think to incorporate as many options as possible to keep our classes inclusive and accessible. This was just a handful today of commonly used poses. If you found it useful, we could do another session like this. I could go through some others. I know we didn't get to like downward facing dog or chaturanga or warriors or trikonasana, shapes like that that are very commonly used. So we could do another session on those shapes. But for today, we are just out of time. So thank you so much for joining. Please leave any comments, suggestions, requests. Let's keep the conversation open. And yeah, that was fun. Thanks for being here. See you very soon. Have a great week. Take care.